Richard Blackwell stood at the window of his office, gazing down at the bustling street below. From the second floor of his restaurant, Harvest Table, he could see the line of eager patrons forming outside, despite the chilly October evening. He checked his watch, 6:15 p.m. 45 minutes until doors opened, and already the crowd stretched around the corner. "Another full house tonight," he murmured, allowing himself a small smile of satisfaction. At 58, Richard had the confident posture of a man who had fought for everything he owned. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly trimmed, his custom suit tailored to hide the slight softening around his middle. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the years, etched there by decades of early mornings and late nights. He turned from the window to survey his office. The walls were adorned with framed accolades. The Michelin star certificate held the place of honor, surrounded by glowing reviews from Boston's top food critics. On his desk sat last quarter's financial reports, showing revenue that had surpassed even his ambitious projections. A knock at the door interrupted his moment of self-congratulation. "Come in," he called, straightening his already perfect tie. Marcus, his general manager, stepped into the room, tablet in hand. "Evening, sir. The team is ready for the pre-service meeting whenever you are." "How's the reservation list looking?" Richard asked, reaching for his suit jacket. "Completely booked as usual. We've got the Henderson party at 8, and the mayor's office called to confirm his table for 9. Richard nodded, pleased but unsurprised. This was simply the standard at Harvest Table now. Boston's elite clamoring for a table, willing to book months in advance for the privilege of spending hundreds of dollars on his executive chef's creations. "And the new server, is she ready for the floor tonight?" "Jessica?" "Yes, sir. Elena's been training her all week. She seems to be catching on quickly." At the mention of Elena, Richard paused. "Elena Vasquez? She's been with us, 3 years now?" "Just about," Marcus confirmed. "One of our most reliable staff members." Richard nodded absently. He prided himself on running a tight ship, but the truth was he knew very little about most of his employees beyond their performance metrics. Names, faces, and efficiency ratings. That was the extent of his personal knowledge. It was simply good business, he told himself. Professional distance helped maintain authority. "Let's not keep them waiting," Richard said, following Marcus out of the office and down the stairs to the main dining room. The restaurant was a study in understated elegance, crisp white tablecloths, soft ambient lighting, and furniture crafted from sustainably sourced walnut. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the upscale neighborhood, while expert soundproofing ensured that conversations remained private. Every detail had been meticulously planned to justify the exorbitant prices on the menu. The staff stood assembled near the bar, servers in pressed black uniforms, bartenders polishing glasses, and busboys arranging fresh flowers. Richard recognized most faces, though some newer hires were still strangers to him. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice commanding immediate attention. "As usual, we have a full house tonight, including several VIPs. I expect nothing less than perfection from each of you." Richard delivered his standard pre-service speech, emphasizing the importance of precision, attention to detail, and the customer experience. He watched as his employees nodded along, some taking notes, others standing perfectly still with expressions of intense concentration. His eyes fell on Elena, standing slightly apart from the group. At 45, she was older than most of the servers, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and an air of quiet competence. She was listening intently, but something in her expression caught Richard's attention. A slight distraction, perhaps, or worry. "That's all," he concluded. "Doors open in 30 minutes. Let's make it another perfect night." As the staff dispersed to their stations, Richard noticed Elena approach Paolo, the head chef, who was heading back to the kitchen. She spoke to him briefly, her voice too low for Richard to hear. Paolo nodded, and Elena's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then she turned and caught Richard watching her. She gave him a polite smile before hurrying to her section. Curious, Richard made his way to the kitchen, where Paolo was barking orders at his team of sous chefs. "Everything all right with Elena?" Richard asked casually. Paolo glanced up from the dish he was arranging. "Oh, yes. She just asked if she could take home some of the leftover bread and appetizers tonight. Things we'd throw out anyway. I said it was fine." "She's done this before?" "Sometimes," Paolo shrugged. "Never anything expensive, just leftovers that would go to waste." Richard frowned slightly. It wasn't against policy exactly, but it struck him as odd. Eleanor was well paid for her position. All his employees were, as it reduced turnover and maintained quality of service. Why would she need to take home scraps? The thought was quickly pushed aside as the doors opened and the first customers of the evening arrived. Richard moved through the dining room, greeting regular patrons by name, ensuring wine was flowing freely and monitoring service with a critical eye. This was his element, orchestrating the perfect dining experience, watching as Boston's elite savored each carefully crafted dish. By 10 p.m., the restaurant was still humming with activity. Richard had just finished charming a table of tech executives when he noticed Elena slipping into the kitchen carrying an empty tote bag. He remembered Paolo's comment and felt a flicker of suspicion. 20 minutes later, Elena emerged from the kitchen, her tote bag now clearly containing something. She spoke briefly to Marcus, who nodded, then headed toward the staff exit. On impulse, Richard followed her. He told himself it was simply due diligence, ensuring his restaurant's resources weren't being misappropriated. Perhaps Elena was reselling the food or supplying another establishment with their leftover items. Such behavior would be unacceptable, regardless of her otherwise exemplary service record. Outside, the October air was crisp with the promise of winter. Richard hung back, watching as Elena walked quickly down the street, her breath forming small clouds in the night air. She turned away from the upscale shopping district, heading toward a less affluent area several blocks away. Richard followed at a distance, curiosity growing with each step. Eleanor moved with purpose, occasionally checking her watch. After about 10 minutes, she approached a plain building with a small sign identifying it as the East Boston Community Center. A dim light shone from inside. Elena knocked on the door, which was promptly opened by an older woman who greeted her with obvious relief. Richard, hidden in the shadows across the street, watched as Elena entered, the door closing behind her. For a moment, he considered leaving. This was clearly not what he had suspected, but something compelled him to cross the street and peer through the window. Inside, he could see Eleanor unpacking her tote bag onto a table. The bread and appetizers from Harvest Table were arranged carefully on plates. A small group of people, perhaps 15 or 20, sat at folding tables, watching expectantly. There were families with children, elderly individuals, and young adults, all dressed simply and watching Eleanor with appreciative eyes. Richard moved to another window for a better view. He saw Eleanor speaking to the group, her expression animated in a way he had never witnessed at the restaurant. She moved among the tables, serving the food with the same grace she showed his wealthy patrons, but with a warmth that seemed more personal. As he watched, a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8, approached Eleanor with a piece of paper. She bent down to his level, examining what appeared to be a drawing. Her face lit up with genuine delight, and she hugged the child before carefully placing the drawing in her bag. Richard felt something unexpected twist in his chest, a sensation he couldn't immediately identify. He watched for several more minutes as Eleanor served, talked, and laughed with these people who clearly knew her well. Eventually, he stepped away from the window, suddenly feeling like an intruder. He walked slowly back toward his restaurant, his mind churning with questions. Why would Elena, after a full shift of serving others, spend her evening serving more people? Who were these individuals at the community center? And why did she never mention this aspect of her life? Back at Harvest Table, the last customers were finishing their desserts and cordials. The staff moved efficiently, turning over tables and preparing for closing. Richard nodded absently at Marcus's closing report, his thoughts still at the community center. "Is everything all right, sir?" Marcus asked, noticing his distraction. "Yes, fine," Richard replied. "Just thinking about some potential improvements." After the last customer departed, Richard retreated to his office. He searched online for information about the East Boston Community Center, finding only a basic website describing it as a gathering place, offering support services for new immigrants and families in transition. He leaned back in his chair, remembering Elena's expression as she served those people, so different from her professional demeanor at the restaurant. There had been joy there, genuine connection. Richard glanced at the financial reports on his desk, then at the framed accolades on his wall. For the first time in years, these symbols of his success felt strangely hollow. He thought about his own journey, not the sanitized version he shared in interviews, but the truth. Born to wealth, he had lost everything in his 20s through poor investments and had to rebuild from nothing. The experience had hardened him, convinced him that success required ruthless efficiency and emotional detachment. Yet tonight he had glimpsed something different. Elena, after working a demanding shift, giving more of herself to help others. It challenged everything he had come to believe about human nature and success. Richard switched off his computer and stood up. Tomorrow, he decided, he would learn more about Elena Vasquez and her community center. Not to discipline her, he was beyond that now, but to understand what drove her. As he locked the restaurant and stepped out into the quiet street, Richard felt a strange sense of anticipation. For the first time in years, he was genuinely curious about someone else's life. The sensation was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, but somehow welcome. The millionaire restaurateur walked to his luxury car, the image of Elena's smile as she hugged that young boy still vivid in his mind. Something had shifted tonight, though he couldn't yet define what. All he knew was that he needed to understand what he had witnessed. Tomorrow would bring answers, and perhaps, though he didn't yet realize it, the beginning of his own transformation. Richard arrived at Harvest Table earlier than usual the next morning. The restaurant wouldn't open for lunch service for several hours, but he wanted time alone to gather his thoughts. Last night's discovery had disrupted his normally orderly mind. He made himself an espresso from the high-end machine in the kitchen and sat at a table near the window, watching as the city came to life. Morning commuters hurried past, clutching coffee cups and checking phones. The scene was familiar, yet Richard viewed it differently today. How many of these people, like Elena, led lives with hidden depths he couldn't imagine? The back door opened, and Paolo, the head chef, entered. He looked surprised to see Richard sitting there. "Morning, boss. Didn't expect to see you this early," Paolo said, hanging up his jacket. "Just getting a head start," Richard replied. He hesitated, then asked, "Paolo, what do you know about Elena?" The chef paused, thinking. "Elena, she's reliable, never late, knows the menu inside out. Customers like her." "I mean personally. Do you know anything about her life outside work?" Paolo shrugged. "Not much. She keeps to herself. I know she came from somewhere in Central America years ago. Has a daughter in college, I think." He gave Richard a curious look. "Why do you ask?" "Just trying to know my staff better," Richard said vaguely. "Good leadership practice." Paolo nodded, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to question his boss further. He disappeared into the kitchen to begin prep work, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. Around 10 o'clock, staff began arriving for the lunch service. Richard watched from his office window as Eleanor walked up to the restaurant. She moved with purpose, her posture straight, despite what must have been exhaustion from her long day and evening yesterday. When she entered, Richard called her into his office. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Blackwell?" Elena asked, standing in the doorway. She looked concerned, clearly wondering if she had done something wrong. "Yes, please sit down." Richard gestured to the chair across from his desk. "How long have you worked here, Elena?" 3 years next month, sir." Richard nodded. "And you've been a reliable employee. Your customer satisfaction ratings are consistently high. Thank you, she said, her expression still guarded. He leaned forward. I noticed yesterday that you took some leftover food home. Elena's face tightened. Yes, sir. Paolo said it was okay. It was just the bread and appetizers that would be thrown out. I'm sorry if that's against policy. I should have asked you directly. It's not against policy, Richard assured her. I'm just curious. What do you do with the food? Elena hesitated, clearly surprised by the question. I volunteer at a community center in East Boston. We serve meals to families who need extra help. We? Richard asked. A small group of volunteers, Elena explained. Many of them were once helped by the center themselves. Like you? Richard asked gently. Elena looked at him sharply, then slowly nodded. Yes. When I first arrived in this country 15 years ago with my daughter, we had nothing. The community center helped us find housing, apply for proper documentation, and get on our feet. Her voice grew stronger. Now that I'm stable, I help others in the same situation. Richard sat back, absorbing this information. That's admirable work. It's necessary work, Elena corrected him, a hint of passion breaking through her professional demeanor. Many of these families are just like mine was, hard-working people caught in difficult circumstances, trying to build better lives. Richard found himself oddly moved by her conviction. How many people do you serve? It varies, usually between 15 and 30 people each night, more at the end of the month when money gets tight for many families. She looked directly at him now. Am I in trouble, Mr. Blackwell? No, not at all, Richard said quickly. In fact, I've been thinking. It seems wasteful for us to throw out perfectly good food when it could help people. Elena's eyes widened slightly. Would the community center benefit from more regular donations from Harvest Table? He asked. Of course, Elena said, surprise evident in her voice. That would be... She paused, searching for words. That would make a significant difference. Then consider it done. I'll speak with Paolo about setting aside quality leftovers each night. You can take them when your shift ends. Elena's professional mask slipped completely, replaced by genuine emotion. Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. That's incredibly generous. Richard waved away her thanks, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. It's good business, better than throwing food away. He shifted papers on his desk, signaling the end of their conversation. That's all, Elena. Thank you. After she left, Richard sat quietly, reflecting on their conversation. Elena's story had affected him more than he expected. He found himself wanting to know more, not just about her, but about the community she served. Later that day, Richard stepped out during the lull between lunch and dinner service. He drove to the East Boston Community Center, parking his luxury car a block away. The center looked different in daylight. A plain brick building with worn steps and a small hand-painted sign. Through the windows, he could see people inside, a woman teaching what appeared to be an English class to a small group of adults. Richard found himself hesitating at the door. What was he doing here? What would he say if someone asked why he had come? Before he could decide, the door opened and an elderly man stepped out, nearly bumping into him. Sorry about that, the man said with a warm smile. Were you coming in? I was just... Richard faltered, then straightened his shoulders. Yes, actually. I'm interested in learning about what you do here. Well, come on in then. I'm Walter, one of the volunteers, always happy to see a new face. Richard followed Walter inside, feeling strangely out of place in his expensive suit. The interior was simple but clean, with mismatched furniture and walls covered in children's artwork and informational posters in multiple languages. First time here? Walter asked. Yes. I heard about your work from... a friend. Walter beamed. Wonderful. Let me show you around. It's not fancy, but we make it work. For the next hour, Walter led Richard through the center, explaining their various programs: English classes, job search assistance, after-school tutoring for children, and of course, the evening meal program. Richard listened intently, asking questions and observing the genuine warmth with which Walter greeted everyone they encountered. "Most of our volunteers have been in these folks' shoes at some point," Walter explained. "Takes one to know one, I always say. I came here from Ireland 60 years ago with nothing but the clothes on my back. Now I help others do what I did, build a life." "And Elena Vasquez?" Richard asked, trying to sound casual. "She volunteers here too, correct?" "Elena." Walter's face lit up. "Salt of the earth, that woman. Runs our evening program almost single-handedly. Works all day at some fancy restaurant, then comes here and serves others." He shook his head admiringly. "And put her daughter through college too. Don't know how she does it." "College?" Richard echoed, remembering Paolo's comment. "Yes, her girl Sophia just graduated last spring, pre-med. Elena worked 3 jobs for years to save up." Walter looked at Richard curiously. "You know Elena?" "Our paths have crossed," Richard said vaguely. "She seems remarkable." "That she is." Walter gestured to a wall of photos. "That's her there, at our Thanksgiving dinner last year." Richard examined the photo. Elena stood surrounded by a diverse group of people, her arm around a young woman who must be her daughter. Her smile was radiant, full of joy and pride, an expression he had never seen at the restaurant. "What made you stop by today?" Walter asked, studying Richard's face. Richard considered the question. "I'm reassessing some priorities," he said finally, "thinking about how to make a more meaningful contribution." Walter nodded approvingly. "Never too late for that. We can always use more help around here if you're interested. Doesn't have to be money, though we wouldn't turn that down," he added with a chuckle. "Sometimes it's just about showing up, being present for people who feel invisible." Invisible. The word struck Richard forcefully. Eleanor had been nearly invisible to him for 3 years, just another employee, a cog in his well-oiled machine. Yet here, she was vital, respected, loved. "I should go," Richard said abruptly. "Thank you for the tour." "Come back anytime," Walter called as Richard headed for the door. "Evening meals start at 7 if you want to see the place really come alive." Back in his car, Richard sat without starting the engine. His conversation with Walter kept replaying in his mind. Eleanor had worked 3 jobs to put her daughter through college. Meanwhile, he had complained last week about the cost of maintaining his vacation home in the Hamptons. The contrast made him deeply uncomfortable. When Richard returned to Harvest's table, he found himself looking at his staff differently. The busboy clearing tables. What was his story? The young hostess seating customers. What dreams was she working toward? For the first time, he saw them as people with lives and struggles beyond their roles in his restaurant. During the dinner service, Richard observed Eleanor closely. She moved efficiently between tables, professional and courteous as always. But now he recognized the slight fatigue in her eyes, knowing she would head to the community center after her shift ended. When the last customers departed, Richard approached Paolo in the kitchen. "About those leftovers we discussed," he said. "I want to expand on that idea. Set aside full meals, not just bread and appetizers, quality items that would otherwise go to waste." Paolo raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a lot of food, boss." "I'm aware," Richard replied. "Package it properly for Elena to transport. And add some fresh items too. Salad, fruit, whatever we have in abundance." "Yes, sir," Paolo said, looking slightly bewildered by this new directive. Richard found Elena collecting her things in the staff room. "Elena, I've spoken with Paolo about the donations. There will be more food tonight, if you can transport it." Elena looked surprised. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. I brought extra bags, but I take the bus so I can only carry so much." Richard hadn't considered this. "I'll arrange for a car service to help you tonight, and going forward, Perhaps we can find a better solution for transportation." "A car service?" Elena repeated, clearly stunned. "That's very generous, but—" "It's practical," Richard interrupted. "No sense in donating food if it can't reach the people who need it." He handed her his business card. "My cell number is on there. Call me if there are any issues with the car service." Later that night, in his empty penthouse apartment, Richard sat with a glass of scotch, staring out at the city lights. His phone lay on the table beside him. Part of him hoped Elena would call with some problem, giving him an excuse to check on how the food donation had been received. The phone remained silent. Richard opened his laptop and searched for Elena Vasquez Boston Community Center. Nothing relevant appeared. Of course, people like Elena didn't make headlines or have digital footprints. They simply did the work, day after day, without recognition or reward. He thought about his own carefully cultivated public image, the interviews in gourmet magazines, the social media presence managed by his PR team, the charity galas where he made carefully calculated donations that generated maximum publicity. What would it be like, he wondered, to do good work simply because it needed doing? To help others without considering the personal benefit? Richard closed his laptop and finished his scotch. Tomorrow, he decided, he would learn more. Not just about Eleanor, but about all his employees. It was time to look beneath the surface of the world he had created, to see what had been invisible to him for far too long. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard found himself drawn deeper into Eleanor's world. He had instructed Paolo to prepare substantial food donations each night, carefully packaged and ready for Elena to take to the community center. He had also arranged for a car service to transport her and the food each evening, a practical solution, he told himself, though he knew it was more than that. Richard had not returned to the community center since his conversation with Walter. Something held him back. Perhaps the uncomfortable feeling of being an outsider looking in, or the strange vulnerability he felt when confronted with the genuine needs of others. Instead, he focused on learning about his employees, starting with simple conversations that gradually revealed the complex lives behind their professional facades. On a particularly busy Friday night, Richard was reviewing reservation details with Marcus when the sous chef, James, approached hesitantly. "Mr. Blackwell, do you have a minute?" James asked, his usually confident demeanor replaced by obvious nervousness. "What is it?" Richard replied, noticing the dark circles under the young man's eyes. "I need to ask for an advance on my next paycheck," James said, lowering his voice. "My mother's medical bills came in higher than expected this month. I've been picking up shifts at other restaurants, but I'm still short." Richard was surprised. James was one of his most talented kitchen staff, commanding a salary well above industry standard. "Your mother is ill?" James nodded. "Cancer. She's responding well to treatment, but the insurance only covers part of it." He straightened his shoulders. "I'll work extra hours to make up for the advance." "That won't be necessary," Richard said, making a quick decision. "I'll have accounting issue the advance today. And James, if you're working multiple jobs, your performance here will suffer. Focus on Harvest Table and your mother. We'll adjust your compensation to make up the difference." James stared at him in disbelief. "Sir, Thank you. I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Richard replied, uncomfortable with the young man's gratitude. "Just keep producing excellent work in my kitchen." After James returned to his station, Marcus gave Richard a curious look. "That was generous of you." Richard shrugged. "It's practical. James is talented. I don't want to lose him to burnout or have his work quality suffer." But as the evening progressed, Richard found himself noticing other signs of strain among his staff. The new busboy, Miguel, moved with the stiffness of someone nursing an injury. The hostess, Amber, took a call during her break that left her eyes red-rimmed and distracted. When Elena arrived for her shift, Richard pulled her aside. "How are things at the community center?" he asked. Elena's face brightened. "Much better, thanks to you. The food donations have made a tremendous difference. We're able to serve more nutritious meals, and people leave with extra food for the next day. She hesitated, then added, "Several families have asked who our new benefactor is. They want to thank you personally." Richard felt a strange mix of pleasure and discomfort. "That's not necessary. I'm glad the donations are helpful." "More than helpful," Elena insisted. "For some of these families, it's the difference between having enough to eat and going hungry." She studied his face. "Would you consider visiting sometime? The children have made thank you cards." Put on the spot, Richard nodded. "Perhaps next week." The dinner service proceeded smoothly, but Richard found himself distracted. He watched Elena move between tables with her usual grace and efficiency, knowing that after her shift, she would head to the community center for several more hours of service. The knowledge both humbled and challenged him. Later that night, after most of the staff had left, Richard was finishing paperwork in his office when he heard a commotion in the alley behind the restaurant. Looking out his window, he saw Miguel, the busboy, pulling a blanket and small bag from behind the dumpster. Concerned, Richard hurried downstairs and out the back door. "Miguel, what are you doing?" The young man froze, caught in the act of what appeared to be setting up a sleeping area. "Mr. Blackwell, I was just—" His voice trailed off, face flushed with embarrassment. "Are you living here?" Richard asked, though the answer was obvious. Miguel's shoulders slumped. "Just temporarily, sir. I lost my apartment last month when the rent increased. I've been looking for a new place, but everything's so expensive and I'm saving for college tuition." He looked up, eyes pleading. "Please don't fire me. I keep everything clean and I'm always on time for my shift." Richard felt something crack inside him. "How long have you been sleeping here?" "About 3 weeks," Miguel admitted. "And no one noticed?" Richard asked, though the question was directed more at himself than at Miguel. "I'm careful. I leave before the morning crew arrives and come back after everyone's gone." Richard shook his head, making a quick decision. "This isn't acceptable, Miguel. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because no employee of mine should be sleeping behind a dumpster." He pulled out his phone. "I own a small apartment building in Dorchester. One of the units is vacant. You can stay there until you find something permanent." Miguel's eyes widened. "Sir, I can't afford—" "We'll work out a reasonable rent based on your salary," Richard interrupted. "Consider it an employee benefit." He made a quick call to his property manager, arranging for Miguel to pick up keys the next morning. Miguel stood speechless, clutching his small bag of possessions. "I don't know how to thank you." "By continuing your education," Richard said firmly, "and by never sleeping in an alley again." After sending Miguel home in a taxi with instructions to return for his shift tomorrow, Richard locked up the restaurant and walked to his car. The encounter had shaken him more than he cared to admit. How many other employees were struggling in ways he had never bothered to notice? The next morning, Richard arrived at the restaurant early and called an emergency meeting with Marcus and his administrative assistant. "I want complete files on all our employees," he instructed. "Not just performance metrics, but personal circumstances, family situations, housing status, educational goals. I want to know if anyone else is in crisis." Marcus looked surprised. "That's a bit unusual, isn't it? Most of them keep their personal lives private." "Then find ways to make them comfortable sharing," Richard insisted. "Create an emergency fund for staff in need. Review our benefits package, healthcare, educational assistance, childcare options. I want Harvest Table to be more than just a workplace." The meeting lasted for hours, with Richard pushing for comprehensive changes to how the restaurant operated. By the time they finished, a new vision had taken shape. One where employee welfare was as important as customer satisfaction and profit margins. That evening, as Richard observed the dinner service, he found himself watching Amber, the hostess, more closely. She was barely 20, with a quiet efficiency that had always impressed him. Now he noticed the way she checked her phone anxiously during brief breaks, the slight tremor in her hands as she seated customers. When there was a lull in arrivals, Richard approached her. "Amber, is everything all right? You seem concerned about something." Amber looked startled by his interest. "I'm fine, Mr. Blackwell. Just a little family stress." "Anything I can help with?" he asked, surprising himself with the offer. Amber hesitated, then the words tumbled out. "My younger siblings are staying with me right now. Our parents were detained by immigration last month. I'm trying to help them get legal representation, but it's expensive, and I'm barely making my own rent." Richard listened, stunned by the burden this young woman had been carrying while maintaining her professional demeanor at work. "How many siblings?" "3, ages 10, 12, and 15. "And you're their sole support right now?" Amber nodded, blinking back tears. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't bring personal problems to work." "No, I'm glad you told me," Richard said firmly. "I know a good immigration attorney. I'll have him contact you tomorrow." He made a mental note to cover the legal fees personally. "And we should discuss adjusting your schedule to accommodate your family responsibilities." The look of relief on Amber's face made Richard's throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Richard replied, echoing his words to James. "Just take care of your family." Later that night, as the restaurant was closing, Eleanor approached Richard as he was reviewing the day's receipts. "Mr. Blackwell," she said quietly, "I've heard about what you did for Miguel and Amber, and James mentioned his situation as well." Richard felt oddly exposed. News travels fast. "In a restaurant? Always." Eleanor smiled slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you. These are good people who work hard. They deserve the help." Richard nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's just good business to take care of valuable employees." "Is that all it is?" Elena asked, her gaze direct and challenging. Richard met her eyes, then looked away. "Perhaps not," he admitted. "I'm beginning to see things differently." "The community center is having a special dinner tomorrow night," Elena said. "Many of the families you've been helping with the food donations will be there. It would mean a lot if you came." Put on the spot again, Richard found he couldn't refuse. "What time?" 7 o'clock. Nothing formal." "I'll be there," he promised, already feeling anxious about the commitment. The next evening, Richard stood outside the East Boston Community Center at precisely 7 o'clock, dressed in the least intimidating clothes he owned, dark jeans and a simple sweater rather than his usual suit. Still, he felt conspicuous as he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The main room had been transformed with colorful decorations and mismatched tables arranged in a large U-shape. About 30 people were already seated, a diverse group of adults and children talking animatedly in multiple languages. Eleanor stood at the front, directing volunteers who were setting up a buffet line with the food from Harvest Table. Walter spotted Richard first and hurried over. "You came. Eleanor said you might, but I wasn't sure. Come in, come in." Richard allowed himself to be led into the room, acutely aware of curious glances from the gathered families. Elena looked up and saw him, her face registering surprise and genuine pleasure. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, approaching him. "I'm so glad you could make it." "Richard, please," he said, feeling strange about formalities in this setting. Eleanor nodded. "Richard, let me introduce you to everyone." What followed was a whirlwind of names and stories as Eleanor led him around the room. Richard met families from El Salvador, Somalia, Haiti, and Ukraine. He spoke with a former doctor who was studying for U.S. medical certification while working as a janitor, and a young mother who attended community college during the day and worked nights as a home health aide. Each person had a story of hardship and hope, of obstacles overcome, and dreams still pursued. And each expressed profound gratitude for the meals that had eased their burden over the past weeks. A small girl approached Richard shyly, holding a handmade card. "This is for you," she said in careful English. "Thank you for the good food." Richard accepted the card, opening it to find a colorful drawing of what appeared to be a restaurant with smiling people inside. "Thank you," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "It's beautiful." During the meal, Richard found himself seated between Walter and a young man named Javier, who was studying engineering at community college while supporting his younger siblings. The food, his own restaurant's creations, tasted different here, shared in this context of genuine need and appreciation. As the evening progressed, Richard observed Elena moving through the room, checking on each family, helping children with their food, translating for those still learning English. She was transformed here, more animated, more herself than he had ever seen her at Harvest Table. When the meal ended, several community members shared stories and songs from their cultures. Children performed a simple dance they had practiced. Throughout it all, Richard watched and listened, increasingly aware of a world that had existed alongside his own for years, invisible to him until now. At the end of the evening, as people began to leave, many stopped to thank Richard personally. Their gratitude made him uncomfortable, but he forced himself to accept it graciously, understanding that allowing people to express thanks was its own form of respect. When only the volunteers remained, cleaning up the space, Elena approached him. "Thank you for coming. It meant a lot to everyone." "I should be thanking you," Richard replied, "for opening my eyes to this." He gestured around the room. "I've lived in Boston for 30 years, and I never knew places like this existed, or people like the ones I met tonight." Elena studied him thoughtfully. "Most people prefer not to see. It's easier that way." "Yes," Richard agreed. "Much easier." He helped stack some chairs, an activity so foreign to his normal routine that it felt almost surreal. "Elena, I want to do more. Not just food donations. Something substantial." "What did you have in mind?" she asked. Richard wasn't sure exactly, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond profit and prestige. "I'm not sure yet, but I have resources that could make a real difference here." Elena smiled. "When you figure it out, let me know. There's always more need than we can meet." As Richard drove home later that night, his mind was racing with ideas and possibilities. The community center dinner had affected him profoundly, cracking open something within him that had been sealed away for decades. In his penthouse apartment, Richard found he couldn't settle into his usual evening routine. Instead, he sat at his desk and began making notes, plans for expanded employee benefits, ideas for community involvement, potential partnerships with educational institutions. A text message interrupted his thoughts. It was from Elena. "Thank you again for coming tonight. The children are still talking about meeting the food angel. You made quite an impression." Richard stared at the message, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Pride, certainly, but also a strange sense of fraud. He had done so little, really, compared to what Elena did every day, and compared to what he could do if he truly committed his resources. "Happy to help," he texted back. "I'm working on some ideas for more substantial support. Would you be willing to meet and discuss possibilities?" Elena's reply came quickly. "Of course. The center is my second home. Stop by anytime." Richard put down his phone, feeling a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since building his restaurant empire, he was excited about something beyond the next review or award. The millionaire restaurateur looked around his luxurious but empty apartment, seeing it with new eyes. All this success, all this wealth. What was it worth if it didn't touch other lives? If it didn't make a difference to people like those he had met tonight? Richard returned to his notes with renewed purpose. He had been given a glimpse beneath the surface of his orderly world, and he couldn't unsee what he had discovered there. Now he had to decide what to do with this new awareness, how to navigate the changing tides of his own heart. UIOP. 6 months had passed since Richard first followed Elena to the community center. 6 months of gradual but profound change, not just in his actions, but in his perspective on success, wealth, and purpose. On a bright spring morning, Richard sat in his office at Harvest Table, reviewing a proposal from a prestigious restaurant group. The offer was substantial, enough money to retire comfortably and never work another day in his life. 6 months ago, he would have accepted without hesitation, proud of building a business valuable enough to command such a price. Now, he found himself hesitating. The restaurant group's plans included streamlining operations and optimizing staff efficiency. Corporate language that Richard now understood meant cutting jobs and increasing workloads for remaining employees. People like Elena, James, Miguel, and Amber would likely be replaced by lower-paid workers with no connection to the community they had built. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Marcus. "The contractor is here to discuss the kitchen renovation plans," Marcus said. "Should I send him in?" "Yes, please," Richard replied, setting aside the acquisition proposal. The contractor, a no-nonsense woman named Diana, spread blueprints across Richard's desk. "We've incorporated all your requirements, Mr. Blackwell. The training kitchen will be separate from the main kitchen but accessible through this connecting hallway. The classroom space can accommodate 20 students comfortably." Richard studied the plans carefully. The expansion would reduce Harvest Table's seating capacity by about 15%, but he had calculated that the remaining tables would still generate healthy profits while allowing space for something new: a culinary training program for immigrants and community center residents. "Timeline?" Richard asked. 3 months, working mostly during off hours to minimize disruption to regular service," Diana replied. "We can start next week if you approve the plans." Richard nodded. "Make it happen." After Diana left, Marcus lingered, a concerned expression on his face. "Are you sure about this, sir? Reducing our capacity will impact revenue significantly." "I'm aware," Richard said calmly. "But we'll gain something more valuable." "The training program?" Marcus asked skeptically. "Exactly." Richard stood up and walked to the window. "Think about it, Marcus. We're not just a restaurant. We're a potential launching pad for careers. People with talent and drive but no opportunity can learn here, then take those skills elsewhere. It's an investment in the community." Marcus looked unconvinced. "And the acquisition offer? They're expecting an answer by Friday." "I know." Richard turned back to his desk. "I'll give them my decision tomorrow." After Marcus left, Richard called Elena and asked her to meet him at the community center that evening. Then he spent the afternoon reviewing the financial projections for his new vision of Harvest Table: part high-end restaurant, part training center, part community resource. The numbers were solid, though less impressive than his current profit margins. The question wasn't whether it could work, but whether he was willing to prioritize impact over maximum profit. That evening, Richard arrived at the East Boston Community Center to find it busier than ever. In the months since his first visit, he had quietly provided funding for expanded programs, more English classes, childcare during evening hours, and a small computer lab for job searches and homework help. The center hummed with activity, every room serving a purpose. Elena met him at the door, her face showing signs of fatigue, but her eyes bright. "Richard, I didn't expect you until later." Over the past months, their relationship had evolved from employer-employee to something closer to friendship, though Richard still felt a certain awe in Elena's presence. Her dedication never wavered, despite the long hours and emotional demands of her work. "I wanted to see the evening classes in action," Richard explained, following Elena inside. "And I have some news to share." They walked through the center, stopping to observe an advanced English class where students practiced job interview skills, then visiting the computer lab where teenagers helped younger children with homework while their parents attended classes. In the kitchen, volunteers prepared dinner using food from Harvest Table, supplemented now with fresh produce from a local farm that Richard had partnered with. The operation was more organized than before, with proper storage and preparation areas, improvements funded by Richard's anonymous donations. "The place has really transformed," Richard commented as they found a quiet corner to talk. "Thanks to you," Elena said. "Your support has made all of this possible." Richard shook his head. "I just provided resources. You and the other volunteers are the ones making the real difference. Speaking of resources, Elena said, Sophia called today. She was accepted to medical school. That's wonderful, Richard exclaimed, genuinely pleased. Over the months, he had gotten to know Elena's daughter through stories and a few brief meetings when she visited Boston. Harvard? Elena nodded, pride evident in her expression. Yes, but she's worried about the cost. I've been saving since she was little, but medical school is so expensive. She'll find a way, Richard said confidently. She's her mother's daughter after all. Elena smiled. Yes, she will. She studied Richard's face. You said you had news? Richard took a deep breath. I've decided to decline the acquisition offer for Harvest Table. Elena's eyes widened. Really? I thought it was a very generous offer. It was, Richard admitted. But I'm not ready to let go of the restaurant, not when I'm just beginning to see its real potential. Potential for what? For change, Richard said simply. I've approved plans to renovate part of the restaurant into a training kitchen and classroom. We're going to launch a culinary training program for people from the community center and similar organizations. Professional skills, certification, job placement assistance, everything needed to start a career in the restaurant industry. Elena stared at him, momentarily speechless. Richard, that's incredible. How many students? 20 per cohort, 4 cohorts per year. And for graduates who show exceptional promise, there will be employment opportunities at Harvest Table or assistants starting their own food businesses. This is going to change lives, Elena said softly. That's the idea. Richard hesitated, then continued. And I'd like you to help run it. Me? Elena looked startled. But I'm not a chef. No, but you understand people and their needs better than anyone I know. Paolo will handle the culinary instruction. I need someone who can manage the human element, selecting candidates, understanding their challenges, helping them succeed beyond the technical skills. Richard leaned forward. It would mean a promotion and a significant salary increase, of course. Elena was quiet for a moment, processing the offer. I would still be able to work with the community center? That's part of the job. The training program and the center would be partners. In fact, I'm establishing a foundation to ensure the center has stable funding going forward. Elena's eyes filled with tears. 6 months ago, I was worried about getting in trouble for taking leftover bread. And now, Richard felt a lump in his throat. I should be thanking you, Elena. You opened my eyes to what was happening right in front of me, to the invisible truths I chose not to see for so many years. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the door. A young woman entered, looking tired but happy, immediately surrounded by people offering congratulations. Sophia! Elena exclaimed, standing up. What are you doing here? I thought you weren't coming until next weekend. I wanted to surprise you, Mom, Sophia said, making her way through the well-wishers. I couldn't wait to celebrate in person. She spotted Richard and smiled. Mr. Blackwell, good to see you again. Richard stood to greet her. Congratulations on your acceptance to medical school. Your mother just told me the news. Thank you, Sophia replied. Now I just need to figure out how to pay for it without taking on crippling debt. Richard exchanged a look with Elena. Perhaps we should discuss that. I've been considering establishing a scholarship fund as part of the foundation work we were just talking about. Sophia looked confused. Foundation? What foundation? Elena explained Richard's plans for the training program and ongoing support for the community center. As she spoke, Sophia's expression changed from confusion to amazement. That's incredible, she said when Elena finished. What made you decide to do all this, Mr. Blackwell? Richard considered the question. How could he explain the profound shift in his worldview over the past 6 months? The gradual awakening to the struggles and triumphs happening all around him that he had previously ignored. Let's just say I received an education, he said finally. Your mother has been an excellent teacher. The evening continued with dinner, the three of them joined by Walter and other regular volunteers. Richard observed the easy camaraderie, the shared purpose that united people from vastly different backgrounds. He still felt somewhat like an outsider, but less so than before. Each visit, each conversation, each small act of genuine connection brought him closer to belonging. After dinner, as people began evening activities and classes, Richard pulled Elena aside. "There's one more thing I wanted to discuss," he said. "The foundation needs a director, someone who understands both the community's needs and the business aspects of running a sustainable organization." Eleanor looked at him warily. "If you're about to offer me another job, I'm not sure I can handle 3 roles." Richard laughed. "No, I was thinking of Sophia, actually, after medical school. The position could be structured to allow her to practice medicine part-time while overseeing the foundation's work. By then, the training program should be well established under your leadership." "You're planning quite far ahead," Eleanor observed. "For the first time in my life, I'm thinking beyond quarterly profits," Richard admitted. "It feels right." Later that night, as Richard drove back to his penthouse, he reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. He had followed Elena that night out of suspicion and found instead a path to redemption he hadn't known he needed. At home, Richard opened his laptop to send a formal response declining the acquisition offer. As he typed, he felt none of the regret or hesitation he might have expected. Instead, there was a sense of purpose and clarity that had been missing from his life for decades. The next morning, Richard arrived at Harvest Table earlier than usual. He wanted time alone in the restaurant before the day began, to simply absorb the space that would soon transform into something new and meaningful. To his surprise, he found James already in the kitchen, preparing ingredients for the day's service. "Early start?" Richard asked. James looked up, slightly startled. "Yes, sir. I'm testing some new recipes for the spring menu." "How's your mother doing?" "Much better, thank you," James replied, clearly still surprised by Richard's personal interest. "The treatments are working, and the financial support has made it possible for her to focus on recovery instead of worrying about bills." Richard nodded, pleased. "And your own health? You were looking quite exhausted a few months ago." "I'm good now that I'm not working 3 jobs," James said with a small smile. "And I've been developing some ideas for the training program. Chef Paolo mentioned you might want input from the kitchen staff." "Absolutely," Richard confirmed. "This needs to be a team effort." As they talked, more staff began to arrive. Miguel, now living in stable housing and attending community college part-time. Amber, whose siblings were adjusting to life in Boston, while their parents' immigration case progressed with the help of Richard's attorney. Paolo, who had enthusiastically embraced the training program concept, seeing it as a way to share his culinary knowledge beyond the elite clientele of Harvest Table. And finally, Eleanor, who gave Richard a warm smile as she prepared for the lunch service. She moved with the same quiet efficiency as always, but there was a new lightness to her step, a sense of excitement about the future they were building together. By evening, when the restaurant was full of customers enjoying their expensive meals, Richard found himself observing the scene with new eyes. The wealthy patrons were still important. Their patronage would help fund the training program and community initiatives, but they were no longer the sole focus of his attention or the only measure of his success. As the service proceeded smoothly, Richard spotted Elena discreetly guiding a new server through a complicated order. The gentle patience she showed reminded him of how she worked with the families at the community center, with respect, empathy, and practical assistance that preserved dignity. In that moment, watching Elena quietly making a difference in yet another person's life, Richard felt a profound sense of clarity. The journey that had begun with following her out of suspicion had led him to a new understanding of wealth and success, one measured not in dollars or accolades, but in the positive impact one could have on others' lives. Later that night, after the restaurant closed, Richard found Elena collecting the food donations for the community center. "Need any help?" he asked. Elena looked up, surprised. "Actually, Yes, Paolo prepared more than usual tonight. Together, they packed the food into containers and loaded them into the car Richard had recently purchased specifically for transporting donations. As they worked side by side, Richard felt a sense of rightness, of purpose fulfilled. "You know," he said as they finished, "6 months ago, I thought I had achieved everything worth achieving. I had the awards, the recognition, the financial success. I thought that was the whole point." Elena smiled. "And now?" Richard looked around at the restaurant that would soon become not just a place of fine dining, but a center for opportunity and transformation. "Now I understand that success isn't what you build for yourself. It's what you build for others." He met Elena's gaze. "Thank you for showing me that." "You were ready to see it," Elena replied simply. "That's why you followed me that night. Something in you was already searching for more." As they walked out to the car together, Richard realized she was right. The wealthy, successful restaurateur who had followed his employee 6 months ago had already been questioning the value of his achievements, already feeling the emptiness of success without purpose. Elena had simply shown him another way forward, a path where wealth became a tool for change rather than merely a measure of personal worth, where success was defined by lives improved rather than profits earned. And as they drove toward the community center, Richard knew with absolute certainty that this new definition of success was the one that would guide the rest of his life.